How's it going, guys? Alex from True Duels here. In today's video, I'm going to be covering something different than what I normally do. Usually, I'm the guy who does the in-depth deck profiles or those super long, explained deck profiles. But today, what I'm going to be talking more about is the meta, where it's headed, the top 5 decks in my opinion, the top 5 cards I think are a problem, and how they impact the format, as well as my theory on sideboard. I call it a theory because, well, I guess we'll get into that later, but without further ado, let's just get right into it. So as many of you know, the dominant deck for the last championship event was the Urgon, the 60 Minutes Urgons deck, the air version, and the deck that won, the Urgon Fizzy deck, which was a great hard counter to the Urgon 60 Minutes air spell version. So those were the two decks, but essentially it was an Urgon deck, a control Urgon deck, and the format was very slow. Most matches you would only have 1, maybe 2 games at most. As of right now, I think the format has more or less stayed kind of in the same position. I think aggro decks are a little bit more viable than they were before with the removal of Urgon and these endless Sylvia loops, or these kind of endless ways to loop just guys in general that would be detrimental to these aggro decks. However, I still think, because of how powerful the black cards are, control is still going to be the dominant deck this meta, however maybe not as slow, since you don't have a way to just keep infinitely recurring guys. You don't have that way to get that continuous oligarch loop where you just keep locking your opponent out of the game via Gloom Oligarch. So I still do think you will see a lot of control decks, but I do think decks like Liam are going to start making a comeback. We didn't really see too many Liam decks in the top cut of the last championship, so I think you'll see those starting to make a comeback. I think you'll start seeing Hoenn Sola getting a little more traction. It was still a very popular deck, however, I do not think it was as represented in top as it should have been. So without further ado, we'll just get right into it. So we'll start with the top 5 decks in my opinion. So I think the best decks right now have to be playing air. And not necessarily all of the top decks in my top 5 are going to be air-based decks, but I do think that the better ones are going to be playing some form of air, and that's because Zephyr Crystal. We'll talk a little bit more about Zephyr Crystal when I get into my top 5 cards list a little later. But so to start, we're going to have, I'll just go right to my deck section. Some of these I'll have sample deck lists for, some I won't, I just don't have them. So number 5, we have Gemiel Kite. This is just a base. I don't have all the cards finished here. If you guys want to get a good Gemiel Kite list, I believe Jesse Unger's channel has one. He just won his most recent regional with it, so I think that's a good place to start. So a Gemiel Kite list is typically just going to look like kind of what a regular Gemiel list would be, but with your 8 air cards, which would probably be, it's always going to be Sylvia, the Dagger more than likely, some amount of Greathawks, Omega Magic Kazi. I think Omega Magic Kazi is actually an auto-include for any air decks, and it's part of what makes air strategies so dominant right now, is that this card just kind of hoses aggro super hard. If you don't know what this card does, it says if you have 2 or less towers remaining, the card costs 0. Normally it costs 2, but what this card does do is it says target unit cannot deal damage or attack this turn, then you draw a card. This is huge versus the aggro decks when you would be tapped out and you have ways to just stop their lethal. It's also very difficult for them to play around since you can actually use it while tapped out. So that's another reason I think air is very strong right now. But so a Gemiel deck kind of is just a cluster of these bounce spells and then some nice little tempo cards. You have cards like your Akuma Wavebender, which is great for tempo. You have obviously your Azure Seers. You have cards like Phantasmal Guards that help you wall up. This deck is very good at stopping aggro decks because you have cards like Phantasmal Guards. You have cards like Akuma Wavebender, which bounce guys back. You have all these bounce spells to kind of stop aggro till you get into the late game and you start playing your heavy hitters. Like Akuma Juggernaut, which is just a total stop to these aggro decks. This guy can block multiple times and kind of just wall up against these aggro decks. The reason this deck is number 5 and not higher on the list is I think this deck suffers a little bit against the Hoenn decks. I think that in a control mirror, Hoenn just does a much better job of being a control deck than this deck does. Well, I think this deck might have some niche positives versus the aggro deck that Hoenn doesn't. I think overall, with Hoenn being a large portion of the field, it's going to be a little lackluster in comparison. I think that Hoenn just has a lot of better on-curve minions than this does, which allows it to gain tempo over it. I think a lot of their removal spells are a lot better. This deck has a lot of cheap bounce spells, but it doesn't actually get rid of the problems. And that's kind of the issue, whereas when you start getting into the late game versus these Hoenn decks, they're gonna, if you bounce their guys, they're gonna be able to just keep replaying these guys and getting their effects over and over again, whether that's Demon of the Evil Eye, Golem of Vengeance, even things like Watchwoman, that just cards that you need to get rid of and you just can't because you don't have any true removal spells. Now, you do have Sylvia, but unfortunately, Sylvia is now vulnerable to removal. One of the biggest things that brings Sylvia down right now is that every deck is more than likely going to be playing the Spirit Ruby, and that's just a 1 mana out at the cost of your Spirit to get rid of Sylvia nearly permanently. There's no real way to recur her anymore as Urgon is gone. The only real way to get it back is like Statue at the Argent Tower. I see some of these decks are now playing Keiko. He's a 3-drop that says you can tap him. Actually, I'll just bring him up on screen. He's a 3-drop that says you can tap him and put any creature from your graveyard on top of your deck. So some people are playing this now to try to get Sylvia back, which isn't a bad option. However, it is a little slow and can get out-tempoed by some of the faster decks as well as even the dark deck. Overall, I think this is a solid choice. Gemmuel brings a lot of draw to the table that Hoenn does not offer. However, I don't think cards is necessarily the name of the game anymore as much as board control is. Hoenn also has ways to get cards back in the form of their own hidden lab. So I think overall this is kind of lackluster in comparison to Hoenn, but still does have its place in the meta. I think if you were predicting maybe a very aggro-heavy meta, this might be a potential option. However, I'm predicting more of a Hoenn-heavy meta, and I don't expect it to be more of an aggro-oriented Hoenn, so I think Hoenn is more the way to go now. Number 4. Where are we here? Nope, that's not that one. Give me a sec here, guys. Ariana Kite. Now, Mono Win is in an interesting position because I think it's the best deck when nobody is playing for it. And what I mean by that is the biggest issue with this deck right now is that its most powerful card is actually checked by Zephyr Crystal, the most popular card right now. Since Air is so popular, Zephyr Crystal just does such a good job of keeping this deck in check. However, I think if Zephyr Crystal were not a card that existed, this would probably be the #1 deck in the format. So right now, as you can see, I have more of an aggressive type mono air deck. The issue I have with the more control versions is that they're too predicated on having your command centers actually survive and then kind of looping cards like the Great Hawk, Sylvia, and even Garga against your opponent, and just kind of fueling up those command centers with your Skytree Engineers. However, because of Command Center's vulnerability to Zephyr Crystal, which is going to be one of the most played cards because of how popular Air is, I don't think this deck is all that viable. I do think it is, at a base level, stronger than the Gemmuel Kite deck. This deck is still just an aggro deck, and it can do that really well. I think this is the only way to play this at this moment in time. I would like to see maybe Zephyr Crystal goes away and we get some type of augment removal, which is a little more fair in my opinion. However, I still think this deck is a great option for an aggro deck. It has a lot of tricks. Skytree Command Center still works, especially when they don't have Zephyr Crystal, and even when they do have Zephyr Crystal, it still costs 3 to Zephyr Crystal this, and they still have to see the Zephyr Crystal, even if the odds are very good. So you can kind of take tempo where they might have to take a turn off to kill your Skytree Command Center. Maybe you already have a few counters on it, and you can use it in response and put a guy into play and kind of just try to like tempo them out, put pressure on them so they never really get the chance to use this Zephyr Crystal. Unfortunately, sometimes this is a little bit of a pipe dream, as these control decks have so many ways to deal with your aggression and can often find time to actually be able to start picking off your Skytree Command Centers. This deck has three main problems. The first one being, as we discussed, the Zephyr Crystal being able to always kill your Command Center. The second one is it runs out of gas really fast, and that's part of the reason I'm playing Ariana over Iton right now, is because it starts you with 2 extra cards in your hand that you're able to pitch with Kite. The amulet also serves a little bit of a secondary purpose. It replaces itself, obviously, but it can also do things like keep Sylvias on the ground for a turn, so you have a way to deal with them, whether that's through your own Sylvia, maybe you tap it down with the Great Hawk of Cloudsea and trade into it, or maybe you just keep it on the board because you don't want them casting it twice in a turn. There's a lot of options there. It also allows you to swing for lethal easier, as Kite is the most popular spirit, as we discussed. Kite has the ability to kind of bounce a guy back, so potentially you can kind of break through with the lethal. If you're able to shut the Kite off for a turn, you know you're going to be swinging for game. It forces them to use the Kite right on the spot. So there's a lot of little niche uses. The other reason I don't like Iton, and this is the third most important thing where I think air decks are lacking right now, is it doesn't really have a lot of good 2-drops. The issue, so as an aggro deck, this deck kind of wants to be aggressive. It's kind of a tempo deck, whether you want to play, whether the control version was viable or you're playing the aggro version. It doesn't have a lot of great 2-drops, and when playing Iton, you need to make sure your curve kind of bridges to the next drop, because that's what he does. He kills a guy and puts a guy that's a higher cost in play. So you want to be able to kind of have enough guys to keep upgrading and have a bridge to the next drop in between. So the issue is, right now there's only one 1500 2-drop, and that's big because you want a 2-drop that is able to actually break all of the towers to be worth playing Iton. Not that this guy's bad per se, but switching your shards to active is not what this deck needs. This deck already has a lot of ways to bypass your mana system. You already have Skytree Command that's putting guys in play for free. You already have Arbor Carbuncle, which is untapping too. You typically have enough mana, so this effect is kind of overkill. It's good, but it's unnecessary. And it'd be nicer if we had a 1500 that maybe drew a card or created some form of advantage or maybe impacted the board in some way. Having a lack of these 2-drops also means, as I said before, you can't break towers with all of them, which is what you want to be doing with this deck. This is a tempo deck, and you definitely do want to be able to break towers with your 2-drops. Because of these three things, the biggest one being the Zephyr Crystal being able to kill Skytree Command Center so easily, I think this deck only comes in at number 4. I think it's a great aggro deck, but it's not even the best aggro deck, in my opinion. There is an aggro deck on this list that we'll discuss shortly that I think just kind of outclasses this as is. Maybe not so much in a mirror match, but against the general meta, I would say it is better. This is, like I said though, this is a deck you need to prepare for. If you don't have Zephyr Crystals, you need to be loaded up on the Acid Monger in the side. This is a deck when you can't deal with Skytree Command Center, can get out of hand very, very quickly, and there's no stop to their loop. Once they have this kind of loop with their Great Hawks and all their Skytree Engineers kind of going, it's very, very hard to escape from, and they can kind of just keep you locked out of the game while they kind of just aggro/tempo you down. Moving on, we have 2 decks, in my opinion, that are tied for slot number 3. I should have just called it a top 6, but that didn't sound as nice to me. And I think these decks are very kind of equal in terms of power level. They do very different things, but in terms of their power level, they're very similar. So we'll start with Hoena Fizzy. Hoena Fizzy is just another control deck, much like the Hoena Kite deck that I'm going to show you a little bit further in this video. One of the downsides that kind of leaves Hoena Fizzy behind the Hoena Kite decks is the lack of Zephyr Crystal. Zephyr Crystal is so huge because it does such a good job of keeping decks like the mono air deck that we mentioned before in its place, as well as keeping decks like the Liam deck in its place. Zephyr Crystal is actually huge versus Liam. The strategy versus Liam has not changed much, where once you hit the late game, you're kind of doing what you did last meta with the Ergon Kite decks, where you just kind of leave all your mana open every turn for your spells and your Zephyr Crystals, and it becomes very, very difficult for them to play the game against you. The loss of this kind of bumps this deck down into third place, or tied for third place. This deck kind of more or less looks to do the same thing that the Hoenn Kite deck looks to do. Instead, it includes some blue cards which serve niche purposes that the air cards do not. In fact, I would say at this point the blue cards are almost somewhat better than the air cards, but the lack of Zephyr Crystal, as I said, kind of puts this deck out of being number one. Chronostasis is nice because it offers an instant speed board wipe, which can be good against control decks and aggro decks alike. You have Ancient Serpent's Breath, which is a great tempo card, especially since this deck can take tempo very early. It is a control deck, but you can play it like a tempo deck and kind of just try to ape your opponent down very fast. You have cards like Akuma Juggernaut, which allow you to kind of defend against aggro decks once you reach the late game. This card, like I mentioned before, is just a great stop to aggro decks. I did make an error. I can't even say the word I'm not even going to try to say it. Please excuse me. I did make an error before. I mentioned that Jesse Unger played Jamiel Kite. However, he did in fact play Hoenn Fizzy to win his regional. So if you want to actually look and check out his deck on his YouTube channel, I'll make sure to post a link in the comments to that. I apologize. I said Jamiel Kite, but that wasn't the deck he played. That was the other deck that I believe he played against in finals. I could be wrong, but I believe that is what he did play against. So if you want a full list, you can check there. I don't have a full list. I just kind of have like a little bit of a base here. A lot of you might be thinking, well, why doesn't this beat the air deck like it did before? Ergon Fizzy used to beat Ergon Kite, so why doesn't this version beat it? And the reason for that is, while you do have Fizzy, which creates a draw engine, Hidden Lab creates a draw engine on its own. And the issue with that is the Kite versions actually have a built-in way to kill your Hidden Laboratory, whereas you don't have a way to kill theirs. So while you do have Fizzy to draw, they have their own Hidden Lab to create a draw engine, which in some cases is a lot better than the Fizzy as a draw engine. You don't have to actually lose a shard to be able to use it. You can also stack multiples of them, so while they can only draw one card a turn, you can be drawing upwards of 3 cards a turn using it. You also kind of have these ways to create a draw engine with it, like Golem of Devourment. While, yes, they do have access to the same card, as mentioned before, you can very easily kill the Hidden Lab, and if they don't have a lot of tempo, you can just straight up on turn 3 say, hey, I'm just going to pay 3 mana and kill Hidden Lab because there's no risk of dying right here. So I think in the late game, you're going to see that Hidden Lab kind of cancels out the advantage they get from Fizzy. You're kind of generating the same amount of cards. They do have access to Acid Monger, but that's obviously not even close to as good of an out to your augments as the Zephyr Crystal is. And because of this, I do not think it'll be like the last meta where you see Hoenn Fizzy being a nice counter to the Hoenn Kite decks. I think Kite is kind of just the end-all be-all now, especially when you don't have ways to keep looping Mayu and picking her up and casting her, and casting, say, your Strike of the Golems or your Cry of Madness to kind of just run them out of cards. I still think this is a viable option, and I do think the blue cards offer some nice niches and little tempo advantages. However, I don't see this consistently beating Hoenn Kite in the matchups that I have tested so far. The other one tied for number 3, Hoenn Sola, and I do have a full list for this one. This is very similar to what Hoenn Sola was last meta. I don't think I've made too many changes, probably just another card on the side. This is just another aggro deck. I think it does a little bit better job of aggroing than the mono air deck does because of Hoenn's ability and all these golems that kind of just are so good at doing aggro's job. You have cards like Hidden Lab 2 that allow you to kind of gas back up and keep going. You also have access to a lot of nice sideboard cards that I think are very good versus control, like Finishing Ray and the Strike of the Golems. I really saw Finishing Ray perform, especially in the people who had ended up taking our list to the championship. I know that Eric Goodwin actually lost to one of our patrons when he went Finishing Ray and then Strike of the Golems. So these are two very good cards. I do think these need to be maining at least one Acid Monger. They have a general vulnerability to the mono air decks, as when Command Center starts going off, like I mentioned, it's just kind of too hard to deal with, especially for these types of decks where you're kind of trying to tempo and they can just reset all that tempo by Command Centering in a Great Hawk and bouncing and tapping stuff and making favorable trades. Overall, I do think this deck is very good. It has a lot more tempo, I think, than the Command Center deck does when it's playing against a non-Zephyr Crystal deck. Or it's playing against a Zephyr Crystal deck, rather. I think Zephyr Crystal decks being able to destroy the Command Center really puts a huge hindrance in the air deck, whereas this deck doesn't suffer so much. If they have to pay 3 mana to destroy your lab, you're not too upset about that, because you still got a 1500 body out of it, and you're still able to keep tempoing them, and they had to waste maybe an entire turn to do so. Overall, I think this is a great pick. I still don't think it compares to the Liam deck in terms of how aggressive it can be and how hard it is to stop, but we're going to talk about that in a second here. The next one, the second best deck, Liam Kite. This is not a good example of what a Liam Kite deck should look like right now, so please completely disregard it. I just kind of have this up as a visual placeholder right now. If you want to check out a good Liam Kite deck, definitely check out Ryan Valentino's most recent video where he posts his most up-to-date Liam Kite deck. So what makes this so much better now? Well, the difference is before Liam Kite would get to or Ergon Kite would get to a point in the game where Liam Kite just couldn't possibly ever win against them, or any Liam deck for that matter, whether it be Liam Fizzy or Liam, let's say they're playing Liam Luna. They kind of just got to this point in the game where they're able to just keep picking up guys every turn, and then they're able to set up that Oligarch loop, and you just can't really play the game against them anymore. They're able to out your guys at instant speed by sacking stuff. They just have a billion devourments because they can keep stacking those every single turn. And their swiftness, they can't even use their augments like their war rooms and their daggers because you're just leaving Zephyr Crystals and spells open every turn. That's not the case anymore. While you still are able to leave Zephyr Crystals open in the late game, you don't have access to infinitely recurring guys that might be a problem. Cards like Gloom Oligarch, cards like Sylvia, you only get one of these, and because of that, the Liam deck now has opportunities to actually try to out and kill these cards. They can play their own Sylvia to get rid of your Sylvia. Any of your threats can kind of be dealt with. They have these other nice little niche green cards like the Cloudhawk, which can deal with certain threats or tap down threats. They just have a lot more ways to deal with your stuff now. The other nice thing they got was let me see if I can remember the name of it. Yes, Versika the Scorpion Hammer. So this card, if you don't know, this is one of the few expansion cards that you're going to find in any of these decks, at least in my opinion, is Versika the Scorpion Hammer. And why Versika the Scorpion Hammer is so good, let me just slide it in here so we can actually see what it does, is it allows you to kind of piece through devourments. Now that you have this card, you can kind of put it on a guy, and where before devourments were a huge threat to this deck, you now have a way where you can kind of just keep going through them. So this says it's a 2-cost augment or gear that says when it's equipped to a guy, they get plus 1000, and whenever they destroy a Guardian unit in battle, you can switch it back to active. And how this game works is, as long as the guy's inactive, it can keep attacking even if it's already attacked for the turn. So this provides a nice little upside against the devourments, and even things like Guardhound, where you can kind of just keep going in and clearing out their plethora of Guardians, which before would kind of wall you out of the game. So this gives it a nice little advantage versus the devourment decks. I still think Devourment is one of the strongest cards in the game, and this doesn't necessarily make Devourment any less playable than it was before. It's just a nice little advantage you get now that kind of helps, and then with the lack of Urgon being able to infinitely recur things, it really puts this deck back in the game. The other nice thing about this deck, and what kind of makes it so much better than all the other aggro decks, is it has techs to actually deal with the other aggro decks. Whereas the other aggro decks don't get too much in aggro mirrors. They don't have a lot of sideboard. They don't have a lot of tech that they can put in to really help them in the mirror. This deck has a lot. So it has Zephyr Crystal, so it can deal with the Command Center decks. It gets access to things like Hikari, so it's able to kind of stop attacks, which it's just a great anti-aggro card overall. It also has access to things like Omega Magic Hikari, which allow you to summon a bunch of blockers at instant speed. It can make 2 tokens when you start getting low. So there's just a lot of good sideboard options for this deck when it does run up against an aggro deck, and that's kind of what I think sets it apart from the other aggro decks, besides also being very, very strong against the control decks. The other nice thing is, this deck, when it goes up against a deck that does not have Zephyr Crystal, kind of just gets to do whatever it wants. It doesn't have to ever live in fear of losing augments on its turn, which is a big thing. Acid Monger is a really easy thing for this deck to play around. Even when they know you have Acid Monger, they can kind of just save all their War Rooms or their Shard Daggers until one turn where they can really go off on you and they know you can't use Acid Monger to interrupt them, whereas Zephyr Crystal is instant speed, so they can't really do that when you play Zephyr Crystal. So that's another big upside that this has versus the non-air decks, and I think it's one of the big reasons that non-Zephyr Crystal including decks are not nearly as viable as ones that do include Zephyr Crystal right now. Overall, I would say there's even merit to saying this is the best deck right now. I think this is a little bit harder to play than control decks, which I know sounds weird because it's an aggro deck, but this deck actually has a lot of intricacies that are not obvious at first. Like, you can't just play like an ape with this deck a lot of the time. There's a lot of setup sometimes. Sometimes you have to know, okay, this is the only turn I have to actually win the game. Knowing when to go off, even knowing when to cast your War Rooms is very important, because sometimes people just run them out there and they lose them and they don't really get value, or they're not as good as they could be. So this is definitely a deck that I would say if you're going to play it, you definitely need to practice with it. Overall, I think this is a really good deck, and if you want a better list, well, an actual real list, I would check out the video that Ryan Valentino just did for this. And the number 1 deck, the Fable Hoenn Kite deck. This deck is more or less the same, kind of the same as the Urgon Kite deck. Now it plays a little less spells and a few different creatures than it did previously. It's a little more control-y. It did get a nice new tool in the form of Demon of the Evil Eye. I think this card is solid, and one of the things that dark decks were kind of missing, especially since you always got to this point in the game with dark decks where you stabilized, but there are still a few cards that can be a threat to you. Cards like Mayu, cards like Iskandar, that's a big one, is Iskandar. Even cards like Sylvia, there are still these cards that even when you're set up and you feel comfortable, that can suddenly come in and kind of ruin your day. And Demon of the Evil Eye does a really good job of addressing these issues. So when you know you're set up, you can kind of run Demon of the Evil Eye out, and even when you're going in blind, just having the security of knowing that these cards are not in their hand is really big. It also synergizes so well with the Dark Tower, so when they hit that Dark Tower, you know it's in their hand, and hopefully you can cast this while some of those cards are still in their hand and get big advantage. It also, there's so many combos too with this deck. Like, it goes so well with Rudy. I think just being able to curve Rudy into a Demon of the Evil Eye, that's game winning as long as you're not too far behind on board. You get one guaranteed hit, and then potentially 2 where you're just even taking 2 cards out of their hand. That's a card swing of 4. They lose 2 and you draw 2. That's huge, especially in a control mirror. So that's, I think, a big upside that they got here. The thing that I think, as I said before, sets this apart from the Fizzy decks now is you have the ability to consistently remove their Hidden Labs, where they can't really do the same with you. They're kind of relying on drawing Acid Monger, which also costs them a card. It's not free like Zephyr Crystal is. They actually have to play a card out of their hand, and 1,000 Body isn't all that great at can break some of the towers, but it's not super, super useful. You got Nanatsu too, which is nice because this deck doesn't really have a ton of great ways to deal with huge threats. Obviously Sylvia comes to mind, but there isn't really any other way besides multiple spells or like a spell and running into a guy to actually deal with a big threat. Especially Delayed Poison kills anything, but in the late game you can kind of just Zephyr Crystal and kill it, so it doesn't do too much. So being able to have another way to kind of just kill things is pretty big. You can also bounce back with Kite, so you can just keep playing it every single turn, which is really nice as well. Overall, I just think this deck is solid. The biggest upside to it over the blue version is having the Zephyr Crystal, which allows you to keep Liam in check, and that's a big part of it. It allows you to keep the command center decks in check so you don't get run over by these aggro decks that are very reliant on their augments. This is actually the list, I think, almost card for card. I'm missing a little bit out of the side because I haven't decided yet. This is almost card for card. The list I'm going to be playing at the upcoming Florida Regional this weekend. You'll notice something kind of peculiar about my sideboard, and that's that I have a lot of 1-drops that kind of do different things, and I'll be talking about that here in a second and kind of what my theory is on sideboard now. So anyways, those are the top 5 decks. If you missed them in order from 1st to 5th, they are Hoenn Kite is 1st, Liam Kite is 2nd, Hoenn Sola and Hoenn Fizzy tied for 3rd, Ariana Kite for 4th, and Jemiel Kite for 5th. There's another deck I want to talk about. I don't think it's in the top 5 decks, but it is an interesting deck, and I think it's one that if you're unprepared against, it will take games off you if you just don't know how the deck operates, and I think you need to familiarize yourself with it, and that's the Oron Kite deck. The Oron Kite deck recently won a regional in Texas, and I think the biggest thing that can be attributed to his success is no one knew about the deck and no one knew what the deck was doing. I'll post a link to that deck profile in the comments, as I will with Jesse's Hoenn Fizzy deck. Kind of what the deck looks to do is just stall out and kind of draw through their deck and just keep repeatedly playing Iskandar and all these other little threats like Silver Watchwoman and Nanatsu to kind of control your board. Really, the deck at its core is just stalling and trying to keep casting Iskandar over and over again. I found that after playing this deck for 4 or 5 games, the strategy to beat it became very apparent. I don't think I ever lost a game to it with Hoenn Kite. I haven't tested with other decks. I don't think it can beat any aggro decks, but if you play against this deck, the best thing you can do is just ape them. Be totally ignorant, just mull for a really good curve, and just go as fast as you can. The deck has a hard time dealing with wide boards. I'm sure some decks will main Finishing Ray or side Finishing Ray, and that's just something you'll have to be conscious of, but the deck really has a hard time because it has to discard a card every single turn. When they're not able to find their mills, and even when they do find their mills, the deck runs out of cards very fast. The other thing that's important is don't let Rudy stick. You don't ever want Rudy to stick around because that's how they're going to draw all their cards. They're going to get 4 with Mel, they're going to get 2 with their statue at the Argent Towers, they're going to get 4 equips when Iskandar comes down. The first Iskandar is always free. You can always kill it for free provided you have the Ruby and there's not much they can do about it. So being able, you always get to kill the first Iskandar without having to worry. It's when they're able to go through their whole deck and shuffle him back in that you start to have a problem. The deck has a very small threat count. They're only playing about 11 creatures, 11 real creatures anyways, and I think 3 of them might be carbuncles. I'd have to double check the count. You can check in the video, so which can't even really kill you. So that's the other downside to their deck is once their threats are gone, they only have their Argent Towers to shuffle them back in. It was even so serious that at one point, if I knew they had like Argent Tower and I could always deal with the threats in hand, I would just have my Demon of the Evil Eye just name Argent Tower because that's the only way they're actually getting guys back. If they play them preemptively, you can even just kill them with Zephyr Crystal and not feel too bad about it. Their deck is not fast without Iskandar. They're not going to kill you out of nowhere. You just need to really try to ape them down, be conscious of a potential Finishing Ray, especially Game 2. And make sure that you don't let Rudy stick around, and you should be fine. I haven't had too much trouble playing against the deck. Like I said, they run themselves out of cards very fast. If you can avoid hitting the blue tower, do so, because you don't want to give them extra cards to keep using Auron with. But it shouldn't be too much of an issue. It's just a deck that I would recommend practicing and playing against, and you shouldn't have too much of a problem.